Good evening, everybody. Guten Abend, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, dear friends of the Bruno Kreisky Forum. I have the honor and the privilege to say a few words of welcome to this amazing group of intellectuals whom we have the pleasure to listen to tonight. For those who are here for the first time, this house, this home, was the home of former Chancellor Bruno Kreisky. And we have the honor to continue his legacy with programs like the one tonight, bringing wonderful, critical, intellectual people together, talk and think. Professor Somek, I'm very, very grateful to you. Since you came here for the first time, you never detached anymore, as far as I saw. And I'm very, very happy that you became a regular in the Kreisky Forum. And thank you very much for bringing this amazing group of people to us. Thank you very much. Yeah. And enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me express my gratitude as well to you and to Susanne Gaugel for making this wonderful venue available for us this evening. And I'm so pleased that we have such a loud crowd tonight. I'm really almost intimidated by these many people. I teach legal philosophy. I usually do not have such a huge audience. Well, let me say something about our guest of honor first before I proceed. Well, actually, let me explain the procedures a little bit. I would like to give you a brief introduction into the book, bullet point style. Don't be afraid, there won't be a PowerPoint presentation, but it's going to be a very short introduction so that you know what we are talking about. This is then followed by two critical interventions, perhaps, by my dear friend Herlinde Pauer-Studer, who is a philosopher, and she would like to focus, if I understand it correctly, on Judith Shklar. And then Fabio Wolkenstein, who is also my friend, a more recent friend than Herlinde. We are old friends, yeah. And Fabio will focus on Hannah Arendt. And then Samuel Moyn, finally, will have plenty of opportunity to give us his own perspective on his book and to reply to some of the things that we have said before. But let me introduce someone who doesn't need an introduction. Samuel Moyn is one of the most renowned and most prolific historians of our time. As is well known, he has written much on the evolution of human rights thinking. And this explains why his work receives much attention from philosophers, political scientists, and legal scholars like myself. His first book, however, was remarkably on Emmanuel Levinas, and it's called The Origins of the Other, in which he explored the intellectual sources of Levinas' thinking. But other books followed in relatively quick succession, the most famous of which perhaps is still The Last Utopia from 2010, the story of the ascendancy of human rights thinking and praxis in the 1970s. It was followed by studies on the Christian roots of modern human rights in the 20th century, and his conjecture that human rights present the last in the sense of the final, but possibly also in the sense of the least inspiring utopia, is thrown into sharper relief even in a book entitled Rights Are Not Enough from 2018. And in this book he continues with much circumspection, yeah, and not with a hammer, but still a venerable left-wing project, namely the critique of rights. The connection between the commitment to humanitarian causes and the increase of violence in international relations is explored in Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. But the topic of tonight's discussion is his most recent book, and this most recent book is about a strand of political philosophy that he calls Cold War liberalism. Now, Moyn didn't coin the term Cold War liberalism himself. Has been used by others before to capture a slightly different phenomenon, namely American welfare state capitalism in competition with the Soviet Union. So others have used Cold War liberalism to describe this phenomenon. But Moyn presents his own conception of this version of the liberal persuasion, by focusing on 6 representative thinkers, and one of those interests us Austrians in particular. And these thinkers are Hannah Arendt, Isaiah Berlin, Gertrude Himmelfarb, Karl Popper, Judith Shklar, and Lionel Trilling. Of all of these, Judith Shklar appears to be the most fascinating, not least because she had already identified what takes to be the mindset of Cold War liberalism before, and criticized it before she eventually fell herself prey to it. She became a Cold War liberal after she saw the dangers of it. There's a cluster of ideas that emerges from the study of all of these thinkers. And this cluster comprises something of an ideal type of the Cold War liberal. And for the purpose of this introduction, I would like to give you now this bullet point style summary of those ideas. They were not shared by all thinkers, and even if they were shared, not with the same emphasis, nevertheless, the ideas amount to a coherent whole. And since 10 is a good number, for religious reasons, I have a number of 10 points. First, most Cold War liberals identify an anti-canon of dangerous continental European thinkers. Chief among them, Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx. Popper went so far back in history to add Plato to the list. Second, the major culprit for totalitarianism in the 20th century is often traced back to the French Revolution. The Jacobins and Sans-Culottes are the root of all evil. So interestingly, the French Revolution is eliminated from the liberal canon, or at least it occupies a very precarious place within it. Third, Cold War liberalism is therefore Anglophile and Anglo-American in its orientation, with the noteworthy exception of Alexis de Tocqueville, who became something like an honorary American for some. Fourth, Cold War liberals are disposed to regard democracy unless it is reined in with counter-majoritarian precautions, such as constitutional courts, as dangerous and easily giving rise to oppression. This attitude may in part explain the reservations that Cold War liberals had about decolonization movements. Fifth, Cold War liberals share a sense of futility with regard to human progress. Any attempt to move beyond the current liberal democratic status quo appears dangerous, ill-conceived, and is considered likely to result in repression, state-authorized violence, and destruction. The belief in utopias disposes people to participate terror and to commit atrocities. Six, this attitude occasionally grows into the propensity to regard all planning and state intervention as presumptuous social engineering that is bound to fail. In this respect, Cold War liberals could easily join forces with neoliberals later. Seventh, Cold War liberals reject what they call historicism as the belief that history moves to some inevitable end state and that this progress is governed by some principle or law of development or law of historical evolution. High hopes for the future are regarded as dangerously naive or susceptible to being used as rationalization for present crimes. Eighth, the rejection of historicism goes hand in hand with an elimination of the belief in the perfectibility of human nature, namely the idea that humans can become better beings under more favorable circumstances. Rather, Cold War liberals believe human nature is aggressive and irretrievably depraved. Ninth, Cold War liberals embrace a modest understanding of freedom, most clearly in the case of Isaiah Berlin. All freedom is freedom from state interference. Preventing cruelty is the most important political task. Tenth, I'm getting to the end of my list, any redistribution of resources in order to facilitate real freedom for all is an anathema. Nobody talks about it. In relation to the welfare state that was flourishing during the time that Cold War liberals were writing their works, remains more or less uneasy or unexplored. Now, why is the subtitle of this book now, if this is the major substance of the doctrine? Why is this liberalism against itself? Isn't this what we in Austria are accustomed to calling liberalism, after we've read Hayek and von Mises? I take it that Moyn believes that Cold War liberals put an end to a predecessor version of liberalism that we associate with thinkers like John Stuart Mill, T.H. Green, L.T. Hobhouse. The emphasis of this new liberalism, when it was still around, lay on human flourishing, self-development, creativity, and enhancing one's experience. The state was supposed to assist people in releasing their energies and to make them freer than they would be without state assistance. Austrians, I've mentioned it, are familiar with this, not familiar with this type of liberalism. It has never been ours. Let me conclude by giving you just two ideas why I find this book is of great relevance today, and I think Fabio will say more about this too. First, some of those who alert us to the dangers of populism and authoritarian democracy today tacitly share the mindset of world-weary Cold War liberals. They've also abandoned all hope in human progress. We are, therefore, currently exposed to a twin danger and need to employ dual vigilance, not only vis-à-vis the populists, but also vis-à-vis those who regard the populists as the devil in democratic disguise. Second, and more generally, in the face of our conflict with Russia and the rise of anti-liberal and xenophobic forces all around the world, we develop an inclination to reduce liberalism to freedom from state oppression and push our commitments to economic freedom on the back burner. But if we abandon this commitment to democratic economic change and the creation of a more egalitarian society, we would succumb to a world in which the technocratic expertise of transnational administrative bodies is only tempered by the Ural elitism of courts, administrators and courts. That's the world that we're moving to. And in such a world, democratic institutions would be of no more than ornamental significance. I stop here because I've already said enough. And I would now like to hand it over to Herlinde. For those of you, the few of you who don't know who Herlinde is a moral philosopher. Her work focuses always on Hume and Kant. She goes back and forth between these two thinkers. She has earned 2 European Research Council grants in succession and used these grants to explore what she calls distortions of normativity, and has done pioneering work to explore the distorted moral world of National Socialism, as you encounter it in particular also in the writings of legal scholars of National Socialism. And there's a famous book of hers that you may have read about a famous Nazi judge, Konrad Morgan, that has almost been transformed into a movie because it's such an engaging story. I stop here. There are many more good things that I could say about you, but I let you go and begin with your presentation. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also for the kind invitation to be part of this discussion here today. I would like to mention the book on Konrad Morgan is a co-authored book. I couldn't have written it on my own as an Austrian, so I had an American co-author, David Welleman. We worked together for years. Now, I would like to congratulate Samuel Moyn for a truly fascinating and challenging book. A book that reminds us, indeed forces us, to think more carefully about how we should react to the current political and social crisis, and whether we do have the theoretical resources to address those crises. Now, the main thesis and main arguments of Samuel's book have already been addressed by my colleague, Sasha Somek. I just would like to repeat here some of the most striking formulations of that book. So I quote Samuel Moyn, "Cold War liberalism was a catastrophe for liberalism." Second quote, "Cold War liberalism left the liberal tradition unrecognizable and in ruins." Third quote, "The Cold War liberals abandoned the Enlightenment, stigmatized Romanticism, and dug the grave of reason in history, purging perfectionism and progressivism from liberals' past." So what was left of liberalism didn't help us, and it didn't address the social questions. Now, as we heard, the criticism is directed against 6 theorists: Judith Shklar, Gertrude Himmelfarb, Hannah Arendt, Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, and Lionel Trilling. All of them had to emigrate from Europe to flee National Socialism, and all of them found refuge either in the UK or in the US. Now, what Samuel criticizes and accuses them of is that they had forgotten the liberalism of the Enlightenment with its substantive ideals, right? And moreover, he objects that they advocated such a reduced understanding of liberalism that they intentionally or unintentionally paved the way for neoliberalism, right? Now, the question is this critique justified? Well, yes and no. It depends where one is looking. We have to see here the context, and we also have to distinguish the different levels, namely the theoretical philosophical discussion on the one hand and the political developments on the other. And my impression when I read the book is that the two things go often together in Samuel's writings, and it's really one of my concerns is that he sometimes fails to clearly separate between those two spheres, the theoretical philosophical discussion and the political development, with the result that he accuses those Cold War liberals of developments for which they, to my mind, weren't altogether responsible. Now, I was asked here to address here in the discussion Judith Shklar's position, right? But first, let me say a word about Isaiah Berlin. Berlin is certainly the philosopher who tended towards a reduced form of liberalism. In his famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, Berlin defended a negative concept of freedom, and he rejected any form of positive freedom. Negative freedom is free from, for example, free from interventions by the state, but positive freedom is what you are able to do as a person. What are your options? What are your chances in society? Now, his critique of positive freedom, it took me a long time to even understand it, is a bit strange, right? Because he says positive freedom, the conception what freedom enables you to do, results in a split self. There is the self that is dominated and the self that dominates, right? And the dominating self tells the self of negative liberty, what to do, what to believe in. It's driven by a conception of the good. It's very authoritarian, and there is thus the danger that state conceptions and state prescriptions of what you should do, what is good for you, enter here via that conception of the self. We can talk about this in the discussion. I would like to leave it here. Just one word. Berlin himself, in that essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, liberty, he made concessions towards positive freedom and said, well, when it comes to movements of social movements of emancipation, we cannot rule out that a positive concept of liberty. Now to Judith Shklar. I really admire her, though as an analytic philosopher, I often find her hard to read, right? She was born in 1928 in Riga, Latvia. She died in 1922 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she is famous for her liberalism of fear. What are the main points here? The main idea is that we should look at what liberalism preserves under dire circumstances, what liberalism preserves in dark times. And so she said we should focus on the negative standard, on the default against which the concept of freedom is measured. And she is not interested in advocating a form of moral perfectionism that dictates to people what the good life for them should consist of. Rather, Shklar is paying attention to what this formula of securing freedom means. And the negative standard here, which should, the thing that should be avoided under all circumstances, is for Shklar cruelty. As she wrote, I quote her, this is a quote from her, "The liberalism of fear does not offer a summum bonum toward which all political agents should strive. But it certainly does begin with a summum malum, which all of us know and would avoid if only we could. That evil is cruelty and the fear it inspires, and the very fear of fear itself. To that extent, the liberalism of fear makes a universal and especially a cosmopolitan claim, as it historically always has done." So my point here is, with this claim to universalism, to a cosmopolitan conception, she's clearly on the line of the Enlightenment, she's on the line of Immanuel Kant. Now, of course, she was influenced by National Socialism. She saw these Cold War liberals, right? They had the personal experience of two terrible authoritarian dictatorial regimes. Stalin's Soviet Union on the one hand, but National Socialism, which affected them personally and directly, right? So, I think the criticism of Shklar is only partially justified. One can ask, did she ever address social inequalities? She only did in passing, right? And it was another liberal who came after her, John Rawls at Harvard. He developed the theory of freedom in combination with a theory of distributive equality. Whether we like it or not, that's another question, but he addressed the questions that the Cold War liberals didn't address. However, I think we need to understand them. We need to understand their time and what they were reacting to. And certainly they were partial. Hannah Arendt, right, was partial towards the US. Isaiah Berlin said England is, how did he say? The country he admires most. Today, given the post-colonial conflicts, we are slightly amazed. But as I said, we have to see them in their context, right? Now, what I like so much about Samuel Moyn's book and what makes it truly fascinating reading is the points he makes, right? For example, with respect to John Rawls, he mentions the irony in Rawls' work, right? namely that it brought about, I quote him, Samuel nearly directed, it brought about a discussion of social equality at home, while social equalities dramatically increased on a global scale. Mm-hmm. And what has liberalism to say today, given these staggering inequalities with which we live? What has liberalism to say to the conflicts we have at the moment in Ukraine? Mm-hmm. These are urgent questions. We need to address them. And of course, the Cold War liberals didn't address them because they lived in another time. I would like to mention one more point because Sasha mentioned it. I've worked a lot on Nazi Germany, particularly the Nazi jurists, right? And if you look at the texts, then you even see a grain of truth in Berlin's criticism of positive freedom. Why? Because the Nazi jurists, and recall, you know, in the 30s, there was a flourishing literature by Nazi jurists. Mm-hmm. They educated the future jurists. Mm-hmm. They had an influence, right, on them. What happened, right? They had a conception of the good which was totalitarian, authoritarian, and by eliminating the, how can you say, by eliminating the borders between the private and public, between ethics and law, they really intervened into the personal lives of citizens or those who were still recognized as citizens, and we know they brutally excluded a part of their citizenship in the most brutal way, right? So here we see this really comprehensive doctrine, what John Rawls has criticized as a comprehensive doctrine, and in the name of the Führer, the state could intervene into the most intimate spheres of our personal lives. And this is at least a question the Cold War liberals addressed directly. Thanks.
Thank you, Herlinde. I can introduce Fabio quickly by saying that he started his academic career as a law student in Vienna and decided to emigrate after one semester because he then obtained his degrees and doctoral degree from the LSE, the London School of Economics, then had a professorship in Denmark and is now fortunately in Vienna. As a political scientist, he works on all issues having to do with democracy, in particular on political parties. His first book is on party reform, and his possibly most famous book in the German-speaking world is his instant classic, The Dark Side of Christian Democracy, History of an Authoritarian Temptation, if I translate it in this way. Fabio, please.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. I also kind of want to kick off by congratulating Sam on a really brilliant book, and I think a book that got me thinking a lot about liberalism. It got me thinking a lot about where we are right now in the world we live in, indeed. And I think, I feel I'm kind of compelled to start out by saying something about why this book is more than just something that people interested in the intellectual history of the 20th century or US intellectual history perhaps should read. I think it's relevant for understanding not just debates about liberalism in the US that are certainly polarizing and polarized, although this is probably the main way in which the book is pitched. I think it's also relevant for understanding more generally, I suppose, politics in the West, including Europe. And I'm going to preface this by saying something, just putting it out there, which is that I think, similar to Sam, as if I understood you correctly, that I think some of the major conflicts that we have today are not so much conflicts about democracy versus authoritarianism, which is how these things are often presented to us, that we're facing kind of a populist revolt against democracy, but we're facing a conflict about what role liberalism has in our lives, and indeed a conflict about the question of whether liberalism is necessarily part of democracy at all. And, well, what the book does, we heard a lot about it. I think in a nutshell, my primary kind of elevator pitch takeaway for a short building like this one is that the book reconstructs a particular tradition of liberal thought that renounces an originally liberal, one might say 19th century liberal in particular, commitment to progress and betterment and emancipation, all of which is part of progress, and focuses instead on something like a stern defense or a preservation of what has been achieved in some countries of the Western Hemisphere, in a world where the West is cast as surrounded by enemies. We heard Herlinde say some of this, also Sasha, before. And in the Cold War, and this is a book about Cold War liberalism, of course, these enemies were, of course, communist countries primarily, spearheaded by the US, and that spreads out, which is a big and important topic tackled in the book, to wars and conflicts of decolonization. So, well, it seems to me that the notion that the West is surrounded by enemies and that we need to protect what is left of democracy and welfare states is very much present in contemporary Europe, and it has very much gained currency again in the last years. It would seem to me to be kind of defining the times we live in without now having to evoke the language of Zeitenwende or anything of that sort. And indeed, some of the most influential politicians who call themselves liberals in contemporary Europe, seems to me at least, present us with visions that closely resemble Cold War liberalism, at least when we present it now in the way that I presented it, as this way of preserving rather than expanding freedom, and indeed, perhaps also the West against the rest, right? It strikes me that the most, or perhaps most powerful liberal politician in Europe, Emmanuel Macron, routinely speaks of a Europe that protects, une Europe qui protège, a vision that came up first in 2017, has actually a left-wing genealogy. It goes back to debates about social Europe, that large parts of the left are also only engaging in think tanks these days. And ultimately what this is about is a Europe that safeguards achievements such as liberal democracy and some level of social security in a world where who would contest this, right? It seems increasingly unlikely that these achievements can be expanded beyond Europe, and where new old enemies such as Russia and China start asserting their power, and ostensibly culturally foreign migrants who at one point bought the strange and ahistorical story that Europe is based on moral universalism, appear to threaten what Ursula von der Leyen calls our European way of life. Notice also, because we're in Austria, you know, there's a liberal party. Some of you might not have heard of it. It's called NEOS. It's very small. And it has campaign posters for their upcoming European Parliament elections. And these are maybe not the most famous ones, but I looked at all the posters, and the prominent theme is defense. What can stop Putin is one of the questions. What can secure our borders is another of the questions on these posters. And indeed, my favorite one, what protects us from Trump? So there are obviously, again, very protective themes being chosen here. And this is the party that is most emphatically on the side of liberalism in the very country we're in. So it seems to me, and here I can only agree with the argument that is offered by Liberalism Against Itself, that ultimately we need to ask ourselves if this is all that liberalism or liberals have to offer in terms of a political vision. It should not surprise us that fewer and fewer people, indeed also in the academy, not just on the street, if there was ever big support, explicit support for liberalism in the first place, find liberalism attractive. So the demise of the attractiveness of liberalism as a political philosophy on the one hand, and maybe something like an ideology on the other, and maybe their confluence in the middle, that seems to be intrinsically connected to also the deflationary view of liberalism. Because ultimately, if I want to be protected, if I want my borders to be safe, if I want perhaps not to keep Putin or Trump out, but if I want the migrants to stay out, I would choose a different party than a liberal party that also advocates the United States of Europe. So what is the way forward? And I think this is where Liberalism Against Itself as a book is incredibly interesting. So I was actually struck by the fact, and it got me thinking a lot about where I stand myself, and I'm gonna, flag it up, I don't know, right? So I'm just gonna raise questions just like the book does. I was struck by the fact that Sam seems to be ultimately, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, quite sanguine about reviving a type of more old-fashioned, progress-oriented, possibly even, teleological version of liberalism, right? Hegel is one of the names mentioned prominently in the book, Hegel as part of the anti-canon of Cold War liberals, right? But what if we try to revive this whilst, of course, trying to also remain sensitive to the shortcomings of this liberal vision, or perhaps more accurately, the abuse of this type of liberalism in projects of, as we all know now, because we're reflecting on this, not just in the academy, but also in public, its abuse in projects of imperial domination, where liberals of the 19th century in particular sought to impose progress on yet-to-be civilized countries and peoples. So ultimately, I closed the book and made many, many notes thinking, what exactly can or should we revive about this type of liberalism, right? What is it that could be problematic about it, and where might we go? And, this big question is maybe going to be answered tonight, but not by me. But I think we can actually get a bit closer to understanding what the problems might be by reading a figure that figures in the book as not a Cold War liberal herself, but as someone whose thought has strong affinities with Cold War liberalism. And that figure is Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is probably, to most of us, not a person we associate with liberalism in the first place, right? But Sam very persuasively puts her in this, one might say, the canon of Cold War liberals, whilst cautioning, of course, us against treating her just as yet another neoliberal, quasi-neoliberal of sorts, right? Maybe, I want to finish with a brief reflection on Arendt and her critique of 19th century progressive liberalism, which might, on one reading of the book, be our best choice moving forward, reviving liberalism, right? So, I'm going to be very brief. This is a public event. We all want to probably go to a reception afterwards. What were the two distinctive features? What was the core, perhaps, of 19th century progressive liberalism? I would say there's two features, and whatever we might think of them, they're really central, and they figure also in the book. One is, it was teleological. History was conceived as progressive. We heard Sasha mention this before, moving towards something like a final goal or telos, freedom, emancipation. Hegel famously speaks of Fortschritt im Bewusstsein der Freiheit. Think of Marx, of course. I don't need to explain how he was committed to such a view of history. And the second feature was that it was civilizationist in some respects, right? Even though there was a commitment to universalism, Europe in general and Western Europe in particular were seen as leading the way in terms of progress. And on some versions of this thinking, of course, and Marx is certainly a culprit to mention here, some peoples were also sort of incapable of progress in conjunction or in consonance with the laws of history that were stipulated. Arendt strikes me as interesting when reflecting on these tenets of 19th century progressive liberalism, because she very emphatically, like other Cold War liberals, dismisses progressive teleology while endorsing Western civilizationism. And Sam calls this powerfully, and somehow I got shivers down my spine reading that. He calls this a commitment to white freedom in Arendt, right? Which is really, irrespective of how much we contextualize her, which is very much there. And when we think of what she said about the civil rights movement in the US, it comes out very clearly. So far as I can see, Arendt has two arguments against progressive teleology, and I think that's more interesting to focus on simply because we presumably all agree that some sort of white freedom type civilizationism is not a good way forward for liberalism in the first place today. So the first argument, as I read Arendt, is what I would call a guilt by association argument, according to which teleological views of history are discredited by the fact that they have been abused by, and now note, revolutionary forces and revolutionaries that she calls out particularly, like Robespierre, to violently impose their will on others. And she mentions only revolutionaries from Jacobins to Leninists, while not saying how this type of progressive teleology has been abused in imperialism, for example, right? And I really recommend reading the chapter on Arendt, because there's a lot of interesting thoughts also on how she dealt with imperialism in her totalitarianism book, but that's for those who really are going to go into the book, which I warmly recommend. So that's the first argument. That doesn't strike me as the most interesting argument, because guilt by association arguments carry a very weak persuasive force to me. It seems like I mean, think of religion. It can be used to justify anything from world peace to brutal torture, right? So that guilt by association for me is not necessarily persuasive. But as a second argument against progressive teleology, which strikes me as more interesting, which is very Arendtian to me at least, and it goes roughly like this. Once we adopt the belief that progress is a historical necessity, kind of in line with these teleological views of history, something that is kind of inescapable is that some of us at least will, in acting on that belief, lose track of the responsibility we have in realizing progress. We will consider ourselves as acting in the name of necessity, and therefore think that to achieve a certain goal, whatever we do might be justified. Now, you might think this is just the same as the guilt by association argument, but it isn't, because that's kind of the reasoning she only sometimes provides in order to explain why that association exists in the first place, right? And so one way of putting the point really bluntly is that Arendt sees a real risk, she would put it more strongly than calling it a risk, that we grow insensitive to the tension between presumed necessity and enacted freedom. And that's something that strikes me as an important thought. I don't think we need to go back to historical revolutions. I don't think we need to go back in time with Arendt. She does that work for us, to see that that tension can easily creep into our actions. And, you know, around the time when I was born, the last great pop cultural Hegelian, Francis Fukuyama, proclaimed that liberal democracy be the final form of human government, the telos of political history, right? That was the last powerful, self-confident proclamation of the type of progressive teleology that we see kind of lingering around as a potential alternative for the future in the book. And that certainly gave rise, or it was used to legitimate a wave of sometimes forced, certainly accelerated democratization across the world, which, you know, I read the democratization literature, and even today, the most uncritical of American liberals seem to be saying that this was a mistake, right? It was an attempt of forcing democratization and liberalism on countries while demonstrating little awareness of how a belief in this necessity that democracy was indeed kind of the final form of human government, liberal democracy, might end up undermining free action on the ground and a sensitivity to the contextuality of political institutions and traditions. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to proclaim some sort of radical relativism, but I'm trying to point out what the problem might be of going back to progressive teleology. Well, surely contemporary liberals would dismiss civilizationism, like Arendt didn't. I'm not sure what sort of teleology, what sort of progressive vision we might choose. I'm also not sure what sort of progressive vision we can choose without defining some sort of telos, some sort of end state that we want to aim at. And this leaves us in this sort of strange impasse. But I think the real contribution of liberalism against itself is not that it gives us the answers to how to resolve this impasse, but rather that it shows us what alternatives we are facing, and that it puts pressure on ways of dismissing that maybe too quickly. And the reason why I picked Arendt is because she strikes me as the one who is perhaps least willing to dismiss it too quickly, and who actually delivers an argument that seems to be more profound than just a fear of decolonial revolutionaries or anything of that sort. But I think we need to take still this seriously, and we need to take her on her own terms when she criticizes the shortcomings of teleological thinking. I'll stop here, and as promised, you know, I didn't promise anything, and I didn't give you anything. So, Sam, up to you.
So, Sam, please reply.
Well, this is a beautiful event for me, and I want to thank the proprietors of this site, and of course, most of all, Sasha, for imagining this event. I feel I don't need to be here because, to begin with, he's summarized my book better than I could have done myself. And then these commentators were extremely generous and have pushed far beyond where I left the topic. So I've learned from them, and I think, as Fabio has concluded, it's now up to us to figure out what to do. I will, just because I am here and because I am so grateful, make a few remarks about what everyone said, but I really have not much to add. I do think Fabio has captured where we stand, and I don't have great ideas either. I'll mention, some things that I think he's gotten right and some places where I might not fully follow him, but I think I have the convenience of being a historian, unlike these philosophers and political theorists. They're the ones who have to imagine next steps. So one short remark just only on Sasha's summary, which is that it's not really correct that no one had canonized these figures in this way before I did, because I think it's actually, certainly in Anglophone discussions, fairly traditional and really spearheaded by a German-American scholar named Jan Werner Müller to group many of these characters, especially Berlin and Popper, and the later Shklar. Often Raymond Aron, the Frenchman, is added together as Cold War liberals, not corresponding to just the kind of welfare capitalist alternative to Soviet communism, but just describing a certain form of liberal thought in the middle of the 20th century. All I did was first reverse the polarities and argue that this tradition in liberalism was bad, not what we need. And then to do so, I tried to add some other figures to the usual list. One of them was Hannah Arendt, who is not a liberal, let alone a Cold War liberal, but I think is useful to think about in connection with the Cold War liberals. Another not mentioned really here is Gertrude Himmelfarb, who I think is absolutely essential for my way of thinking, because she really thinks that liberals, though she's a Jew, not an emigre, but a Jew, needs to revive Christian original sin to save itself. And so I emphasize that quite a lot. And Lionel Trilling should be mentioned, since he's probably the least known of all those I talk about, but the most famous American, and I think the most interesting and subtle Cold War liberal, in part because he helped Americanize your Viennese friend, Sigmund Freud, as the kind of secular Augustinian prophet of the endurance of original sin, which Freud calls aggression. That places limits on human ambition, including the ambition of liberals. So there's less. I need to be modest in saying I inherited this phrase Cold War liberalism, and even some of the people used that phrase is used to describe, and then I've tried to argue angrily that if there's that group, we should reject their work. So let me say a few words about Herlinde, because I find myself in such a deep agreement with everything she said, but that must be because I think I made different arguments. If she's attacking me and I agree with her, then it must be that I was confusing in where I stand. Because really there's a primary argument in liberalism against itself, which is merely that this group of thinkers change liberalism. And most of the effort in the book is put to showing descriptively how that was true, most especially in the kind of methodology that Sasha reconstructed by looking at who they hated and who they came to love, hating emancipatory sources from Rousseau through the French Revolution, through Hegel, and loving then Augustine and Freud. But then there is a subsidiary argument, and it's not the main argument, although it's interesting that it's gotten the most attention in some of the reception, which is that we have to ponder the relationship between Cold War liberalism and neoliberalism. Now, I wouldn't frame that problem as a problem of theory and practice, because actually the Cold War liberals seem to be defending a West that is at the height of the welfare state and social democratic statism and egalitarianism and redistribution, which they barely talk about. And if there's a connection to neoliberalism, it can't be that they were really neoliberals. And so I make two modest and tentative suggestions about what the connection could nonetheless be. And one is just about overlap, that when we look at the fear of the state and the fear of the interventionist state in Cold War liberals, though sometimes they themselves are social democrats in their personal beliefs and their voting behavior, they seem very close to neoliberals, like, again, your friend from here, Professor von Hayek. But then there's another argument, really, which is that what I wonder, and I'm not sure how strongly to make this argument, what were the consequences in political theory of presenting liberalism in so anti-statist and libertarian a way that, though not neoliberal, raises the question of what could Cold War liberalism have to do with the neoliberalism that succeeded the Cold War liberal era? And I frame my answer to that by saying maybe the Cold War liberals left liberalism unprepared for when circumstances were propitious for neoliberals to have their moment of practical impact, which of course wasn't in the 1940s, but in the 1970s. And so that's the form of the argument, and I just want to emphasize that, once again, that it's modest and weak. I'm not trying to claim some direct and really comprehensive causal relationship between Cold War liberalism and neoliberalism. Nonetheless, if we haven't acknowledged that there's something to explore there, I think we haven't kind of faced the dark side of Cold War liberalism. And I emphasize this because, in my way of thinking, the promoters of Cold War liberalism, who are legion, today they often are neoliberal in their sentiments. But even when they're not, they refuse to investigate this connection. And in this regard, though, my main argument is about how the Cold War liberals changed liberalism. I do think it's also a call to start thinking about the connections. Okay, so then a couple of other comments on Herlinde's remarks. I agree that the Cold War liberals were cosmopolitan up to a point. Now, there's a chapter in the book that suggests that, like perhaps Kant and Hegel themselves, one can be for universal values and, in fact and practice, racist. And maybe that was true of the Cold War liberals. But she's utterly correct that the liberalism of fear, as such, is cosmopolitan. But it's surely not the only possible liberal cosmopolitanism. One could imagine a liberalism of hope, that prioritizes the promotion of a highest good that is equally cosmopolitan. So to say that the liberalism of fear was cosmopolitan is, in the end, not to determine very much. I don't want to make this discussion about Immanuel Kant, whom she referenced at that moment. But in my way of thinking, Kant was not a prophet of Cold War liberalism, although in his legal theory, he does assume some malignity about human beings. But at the core of Kant's moral thinking is the emancipatory spirit that gave rise to the possibility of Hegelianism and Marxism in the influence he underwent from Rousseau and his remarks about progress and the possibility of a second nature, a discourse in modern thought that Kant founded, that culture could replace our bestial instincts with something better and emancipated. I think that Kant was very different from Shklar, who basically says, in a kind of Hobbesian spirit, we are beasts, and forever we must prioritize fear of one another and the state and preservation of our bodily integrity as the absolute priority in politics. That is not Kantian politics, let alone Hegelian. It's of course true that those who speak of the highest good, maybe like some of the Nazi philosophers in Herlinde's amazing work, were bad, but it would be absurd to conclude that Adolf Hitler has ruled out any discussion of what we're here for and what it's the purpose of politics to do, not to allow us to believe what we like in private, but to pursue emancipation collectively. And so I think that she's perfectly right that we should learn some lessons from the middle of the 20th century, but I guess I would worry that the Cold War liberals teach us now that you can overlearn from the 20th century, and we're in a different century now, and our problems are, I believe, quite different. Maybe come back to this when I get to Fabio. Okay, so Fabio said some really brilliant things. I am completely in agreement with him that never has Cold War liberal thought been as current, not just in America, but on this continent as right now. And of course, one reason is that Vladimir Putin gave it a gift to Cold War liberals and Cold War liberal thinking. I believe it was on the ropes or on the defensive, and on the ropes is an American boxing idiom, which I shouldn't use here. But it was on the defensive before Vladimir Putin helped revive it. But of course, there are really bigger reasons why Cold War liberalism is in the ascendancy, and it's because of our problems at home, Donald Trump, and your problems, which seem to be, if not here, then coming. And to me, those are not due to despots abroad who are an eternal liberal problem and may always be, but they're self-imposed mistakes. They're due to self-imposed mistakes by liberals themselves who have bred their own opponents, not on the other side of Ukraine, but in this country, in Germany, with the rise of the far right, in France, in my country. So instead of facing outwards, I agree with Fabio, it's a good time not to, let's say, scapegoat despots abroad who've always been there, as the most prevalent form of government in human affairs. And to be frank, it's not a problem we know how to solve yet. I mean, there was an attempt to spread freedom by force of arms, not just in the 19th century, under imperialist auspices, but in our lifetimes. What was the Iraq War about, which many Europeans, of course, supported? And that means that, we have a very great difficulty if we believe in human freedom about how to propagate it where it doesn't exist to any extent. But our bigger problem, as Fabio says, is how do we reimagine freedom for ourselves and make it credible for our fellow citizens? So that's the problem. I agree with you completely. And then the question is on you as a theorist. I will say a few things about my intuition about what an appealing liberalism would look like. I mean, my book basically says we should take a second look at what the Cold War liberals trashed. And it's partly a teleology, which I should say a few words about, or a theory of progress. But I would begin with perfectionism, because this is something that I think Herlinde emphasized, but that I think liberals in general in recent history, including most obviously John Rawls for all his egalitarianism, have abandoned. And to my way of thinking, this is something that has made liberalism less appealing, especially in the face of a far right that claims to offer, especially in its reactionary Christian forms, a recipe for how to live your life. If liberals have nothing to say, even though they helped invent modern emancipation, then I think they won't deserve to lose, but they will be more likely to lose. And I don't just mean elections. I mean the cultural struggle over what we should believe about the nature of our lives and our future in common. So that suggests that we might need, independently of this thinking about a revived teleology, a liberalism of the summum bonum. And once again, that could be cosmopolitan. No liberal could believe in a summum bonum that ended up being totalitarian. And if we don't believe that mere talk about or even attempts to institutionalize a theory of the good life lead to totalitarianism, then it seems as if we should go back and excavate the liberal commitment to it, which was characteristic of Constant's theory of liberal freedom, of Tocqueville's and Mill's too. So then we come to teleology, and I really like Fabio's remarks on this score. I didn't fully understand what he said about the prospects of neo-Hegelianism. I would have said that Francis Fukuyama's problem was that he was a right-wing Hegelian with a strong admixture of Nietzscheanism, the last man and so forth. But that leaves open the possibility of a revived left Hegelianism. And then the question is what that looks like. I really like your point, and I did try to emphasize it in the book, that Arendt is a stern critic of necessitarianism, much like Karl Popper, one other of your Viennese friends. Her critique is more powerful, I think. And I probably would agree with you that that could have been emphasized. But as far as I can see, most teleological thinking in the 19th century is not necessitarian. Furthermore, there are a lot of necessitarians who believe in historical scripts who are not liberal. Most 19th century philosophers of history, or historicists in Popper's sense, were not liberals. So then we're in this very interesting situation where it seems as if many liberals were not necessitarian, and there's nothing about necessitarian that tarnishes liberalism. Indeed, it tarnishes a lot of dead forms of thought, maybe most especially Marxism, although there are revivalists of Marxism today too. So where does that leave us? I mean, I would think we could go back to these 19th century liberals in that respect too. We would need a form of teleology without necessity. And that's not hard as a general matter to imagine. I don't think Hegel had a necessitarian view. We could debate that. Tocqueville certainly did not. In his, I think, amazing introduction to democracy in America, he tells a story about secular providence. The coming of democracy is something that is told in almost a Hegelian vein. But then he says, this could be turned to good account or bad account. And immortally, he says, our fate is in our hands. So why does there need to be a death of choice and liberty, as the Cold War liberals believed, merely because one is trying to understand where freedom came from and what its future could be? I don't see why. So this would be a very broad and vague program, perfectionist and progressivist, but not in a necessitarian sense. I don't think, maybe here's my sole note of disagreement, that besides her very interesting critique of necessity, that we should look to her for her account of freedom, which to my way of thinking is too neo-Roman. In our debates about political theory, Berlin's negative freedom is often contrasted with Republican liberty. But liberals don't believe mostly in Republican liberty, which defines the highest life in terms of public affairs. That's the Roman view, that was Arendt's view. But there's no reason why we shouldn't think of the creative emancipation we all have a chance to enact in our lives in modern circumstances as political in that sense. It might involve artistry of different kinds. And so Arendt, I think, was insensitive to that because she relied on the public-private distinction and really revived a neo-Roman theory. And that's why I would support returning to Mill and Tocqueville, who didn't make that mistake.
All right. Thank you very much, Sam. The members on the podium have now spoken for more than an hour. This means that we should give you finally an opportunity to ask questions, objections, concerns, or develop beautiful visions for liberalism in the future.